Welcome back to another violin tutorial video. In this next set of videos, we'll be exploring bow technique and looking very deeply at specific foundational bow strokes. Why focus on the bow? The bow, historically, is the soul of the violin. This was something referred to by many writers of the 17th and 18th centuries. And the right hand, in terms of what we do, really does make the music. We often in our practicing focus a lot on the left hand, but without the bow, nothing can speak. So with bow strokes, we'll look at specific ones that become the foundation for a lot of our technique. But before we jump into the first one, let's review the difference between musical articulation and bow strokes. So a musical articulation is something that describes sound or specific aural information that's played by any instrument. So for example, the term staccato, which means separated, or legato, which means connected, or marcato, which means very marked. That can be played by a violin, but it can also be played by a piano or a trumpet or any variety of instruments. So when we talk about articulations, that's mostly the aural information that we're trying to create or what the composer wants us to try to come up with. A bow stroke, on the other hand, is the technique that we use to accomplish a specific articulation, or the physical motion that we use to create it. So in the big picture, articulation is what we want it to sound like. The stroke is how we accomplish that. It's important to make that designation because there's some confusion and a little bit of overlap of terms. But when we're teaching technique, we want to focus on the stroke. So the first stroke that we'll talk about is called Détaché. Détaché is a very simple concept, but it can be confusing because of the term itself. It's a term in French, and in French it means separated or detached. Now we have to make sure we remember this is not separated or detached articulation. This is just separate and detached bow technique. In other words, up and down bow, separate bow, or not slurred. Okay, that's the simple definition, not slurred. Détaché is a French term. Why do we have all these French terms in our vocabulary? It's because there was a very important school of violin in the early 19th century. We're talking early 1800s, centered in Paris. And it was headed by three important violin teachers at the time, Pierre Rode, Rudolf Kreutzer, and Pierre BYU. And you may have heard of Rode and Kreutzer. They've given us some caprices and etudes that we still play today. But because of their influence and how much the whole continent of Europe was looking to Paris for being the leader of the musical life, particularly in string playing, we have retained many of these bow stroke terms in French. And so think of some of our terms like Détaché and Martelé and ricochet and sautiller and others. So it's not unimportant that we retain these French terms. So let's talk about what détaché is and how we might approach it. So détaché on the string is just back and forth, up and down, as opposed to legato. And that can be done in a huge variety of ways. It can be small bows connected, small bows separated, large bows connected or anything in between, or even big separations that way. Anything that uses up and down separate strokes is what we would consider détaché. Just one other little important perspective. The bow that we use today, our modern bow, quote unquote, was invented in the 1790s. It didn't become standard until about 1830. That's our modern equipment that we're using. But before that, bows were a little bit different in terms of their design. And I want to show you a couple of historic bows to see what détaché felt like on those and why it was so important that we have this modern bow. The first one I'll show is a reproduction of a Baroque bow that would have been used probably in the early 18th century, about 1720s or 30s, something like that. You can see it's a little different shape than a modern bow. It does have a very fancifully carved bone frog down here, although that's not necessarily functional. But the tip is a different shape. It's got a swan's head shape. and there's very little height on the tip of the bow. When we do détaché on this type of lighter, shorter Baroque bow, I can sustain somewhat, but the natural feeling, because of its weight and its balance and the fact that the tip is weak, is more separated. There's more decay to the sound. So sometimes we say, well, détaché means separated. It would sound more separated on a Baroque bow than on our modern bow, but it's not referring to sound, it's just referring to our motion up and down. Let me show you a couple of more. This one is what we would call a type of transitional bow. This bow is a reproduction from a bow that was made in France around the 1770s. And compared to the Baroque bow, it's a little bit longer. It still has a sort of sloped tip, but there's more height at the tip, which gives it just a little bit more stability. There's also just a little bit of a camber, what we call camber in the stick, where there's kind of an inward curvature here. What camber does is gives us the ability to leverage weight into the farthest part of the bow. So compared to the Baroque bow, I can sustain a little bit more to the tip than I could before, but it's still weaker, and it doesn't have as much hair, and it doesn't have a ferrule at the end that keeps the hair spread out so they can get all clumped up. We can't control the nuance of the tilt of the bow, so still some interesting differences. This last one is also a transitional style, but this is from a model that was made in Germany that has a style of tip that we sometimes call a Kramer head tip. And it's associated with a violinist from the Mannheim school and his style of playing. Now this looks a little bit more like a modern bow tip because it's really quite high, it's heavier, it's a little chunkier, but one difference is that on the back side there's a slope to the wood part which gives it actually maybe a little too much weight. Sometimes we call this a battle axe design as opposed to a hatchet head design on our modern bow. You can see that the frog is also very open, a lot more distance between the frog and the stick, or the hair in the stick, than our modern bow. And this one is similar in its properties. There is a sense of articulation in the tip of the bow, but it still has a little bit of a squishy springiness to it, and the weight is a lot lighter. So what's the point of using all these bows? The idea is that Detaché had different properties of articulation through history because of the equipment that was being used. Equipment definitely informs style and vice versa. When we finally do get to our modern bow, this is a Tort model. Like I say, probably codified around 1795 into 1800. The difference is we have more consistent camber or slope. The hatchet head is just a little bit more compact. And we have the ferrule with a wider ribbon of hair with more control. And now my détaché can be actually very legato and very smooth. So, as we try to know how to do this well on our modern bow, let's talk first about weight transfer. We're doing our Suzuki variation in the middle of the bow. We want to have a loose left or right arm to have gravity kind of hit the string. We want the bow grip to be relatively neutral, and then the motion itself is just opening and closing from the elbow joint. A bad example would be, as you know, where the elbow is stiff and we're kind of using the shoulder muscles rather than just hanging and then opening. If we're using that same stroke at the tip of the bow, the weight transfer is more towards the front of the hand or the first finger. And then as long as it still feels like we're hanging, all we need to do is pronate a little bit, which is that doorknob twisting motion where the bones in our forearm rotate over one another. Pronation that way, and that gives us a sense of weight. When we're playing the frog, the weight comes through the back of the hand. You won't have enough room for the wrist and the fingers to move and for that sense of hanging to still happen. So let's look at a couple of examples of Detaché in the repertoire. This first one is from the Vitali Chaconne for violin in G minor, which has a lot of big open bows, but very connected. And you might say that it's really utilizing this new invention of our 1790s bow. Vitali, ironically, was a Baroque composer, but the version that we have that we play, that Heifetz made famous in the 1930s, is very much a romantic version of the original Vitali variations. Here's the opening of the Vitali Chaconne. So connected and using the entire bow. The next example I'll play is from the Fritz Kreisler Preludium and Allegro, which also uses long, slow détaché, but with some accents at the beginning, which some writers would have called grand détaché, or large détaché. So Preludium and Allegro. And the last one is just a very small excerpt from the Spring Concerto by Vivaldi from the Four Seasons. In the last movement, there's a 6/8 sort of dance-like rhythm, but it's executed basically all separate bows. Which actually would feel really good with that Baroque bow that I was using earlier. We'll now show you a couple of other clips from the Bach partitas and sonatas. First, Noel will play part of the D minor partita, the Gigue movement, and then Christelle will play the Presto movement from the G minor sonata. Both are examples of small détaché in the middle of the bow in a relatively fast tempo. Welcome back. Just to conclude, Detaché Stroke is up and down, separated or not slurred. It can be used to create a whole variety of articulations, from separated to smooth, from big to small, and becomes the foundation or the common ancestor for many other bow strokes that we'll talk about, including the one for the next video, which is Martelé. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.